It is that time of year again. Let's talk about some bookish superlatives from my 2024 reading. I love a list video, and so does literally everybody else on YouTube at this time of year. Here's the season. Today we're just talking about my bookish superlatives. You will most likely hear Ratty crying at the door. If I let her in, she will wreak havoc and trample over my desk, and I can't have that. So she's just gonna have to stay there, and I have to apologise for the sounds. Right, we're gonna kick it off with the funniest book that I read all year. Let's shuffle on over so you've got some room. My runners-up for this category are any Richard Osman book. I think I read all of the Thursday Murder Club books this year, and I also read We Solve Murders. So funny, like, he does it. He is definitely a runner-up. So is Benjamin Stevenson. I read 3 of his books this year. Very funny, very meta, very fourth wall breaking. Both him and Osman are thriller mystery writers. Dead Cattail Assassins also gets a shout out for being funny. It's a novella by P. Jelly Clark, and it is like dry, sarky humour that's taken the piss out of what is just kind of a ridiculous situation, and they're aware of it, but they have to live through it. So humour's the way they're going to carve through that. The last runner-up is going to be Feet of Clay by Terry Pratchett, because it's Pratchett. His whole thing is satire. For me, this is the funniest because it's also one of the most poignant Pratchett books that I've read. So the humour is like a lovely counterweight to some of the like darker themes that I won't go into right now. But my winner for the funniest book is Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I can't go into much detail about why it's the funniest book, because it is the third in the series, so I'm not going to spoil anything. But Nona is just the sweetest little, most chaotic cinnamon roll you've ever met in your life. And she has such a unique worldview for the clusterfuck of shitstorms that she lives in. She just handles it with humour and grace, and she doesn't always know she's being funny. I think that's one of the reasons I love this book so much, is that she's just being herself in like that childlike, innocent way, and the world is going to shit around her, and just the things that she says and the reactions that the people around her have. Chef's kiss. Chef's kiss. She is the funniest person that I read about this year. Right, so the next category is the Vibiest book, and by this I mean the kind of book that has vibes that make my brain go ding, the kind of vibes that I find it really hard to put into words, but I know as soon as I feel them and I get a sense of them that I'm going to absolutely love what's in that book or what's in that film or whatever. Runners up for this, Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell. I cannot explain how much I loved this book and how much of a surprise it was, because this is a romance. It is a monster romance, but it's like monster in the deepest, darkest sense of the word. Shasheshan is a shapeshifter. She can absorb shit into her amorphous blob of a body to turn it into whatever shape she wants. She falls for a human, but initially that's only because she wants to lay her eggs in her, which is a great concept for a romance. Like, it's just fantastic. This is funny, this is heartwarming, this is like fantasy light, so it's like D&D fantasy where you kind of know the world building rules, like it doesn't take a lot to sink yourself into that kind of setting. It was funny, it was heartwarming, it's got plus size characters, it's got a villain you want to smack. But the vibes were just immaculate. If you like the gore and the horror from the ninth, like Gideon, Harrow and Nona, if you like that kind of like bodily gore, you will like Someone You Can Build a Nest In. And it's less complicated. Second runner-up, because we're still only runner-ups, Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Loved it. Loved it. Fungus. The whole world runs on fungus. You have giant kraken leviathans that live in the sea that sometimes come up on land. Their whole science and magic is not really magic. It's just built around fungus and spores and the abilities that some of these fungi can give you for various things. It's a Sherlock Holmes / Watson mystery. And I just loved it. I just really, really enjoyed it. Also vibes, Deadly Education. This is an older book now. It's by Naomi Novik. And it's about a magic school where all teenagers who have magic must go there, because if you have magic, monsters are trying to seek you out and kill you. They will hunt you down for your magic. So the safest place to be is in the school, but the school is not safe. The school is actively trying to kill you because some monsters do seep in and will attack you. And it's just like, the first time I read it, because this was a reread, the first time I read it, I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. I thought it was so clever. Good God, Kat. I thought it was so clever. And on my reread, now like 5 or 6 years older than I was when I first read it. It's so sad. Elle is just miserable. Our main protagonist is miserable. But I think the combination of the kick-ass protagonist, the action, the magic school, the lessons they have in school, the way they have to form, like, band together to do things and survive this school, chef's kiss. However, my winner for the Vibiest book of this year is Fog and Fireflies by T.H. Lennon. I got an arc of this year on NetGalley and it was just fantastic. It is like Ghibli vibes. We focus on a village, one of many, in the centre of this like all-consuming carnivorous fog that targets adults. So what they've done is they've trained the children to protect the village. So the children are the ones walking the walls, checking for fog, looking out, doing what they need to do to keep the village safe. And that dynamic is really interesting between the children and the adults. And then one day a caravan of wanderers who are able to wander the fog come in to trade and shit goes down, everything goes up in the air. And it is just one of the most magical settings I think I've ever read about. And it's unique. I've not quite read anything like this before. It is just so interesting. And it just made my brain go ding in the same way that watching Howl's Moving Castle or Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke, any of those films, just the same, it scratched the same itch. So it wins the Vibiest category. In that vein, the most magical books that I read, I've got to start off with Fairies by Brian Froud and Alan Lee. It's about fairies. They're two of my favourite artists. They've got stories about fairies. They've got magical drawings about fairies. This has to be a runner-up. Silver in the Wood, also a runner-up. Fantastic. Emily Tesh. Novella, queer, forest magic. Kind of takes the hermit in the wood trope and makes it just adorable. I love it so much. There's also a sequel, which is cute. And then my third runner-up is House of Frank by Kay Sinclair. I also got an arc of this on NetGalley. Oh, this book was beautiful. The way that the magic was talked about. It's going to sound so sappy, but the real magic was like the connections formed between the characters. I can't take myself seriously as I say that, but it was a magical setting. It's a fantasy book about grief, about friendship, about owning up to past mistakes and moving forward and letting go of the past. And it's beautiful. It was also just the setting itself was magical. It's an arboretum that doubles as like a funeral home, so you can go and bury your loved one under a tree, and there's a house full of people that live there and run the ceremonies and keep the house going. And I loved it with every inch of me. Oh, it's brilliant. That's not even my winner. What's my winner? Kaikei was my winner for the most magical, because I have not read a book in such a long time that takes such a simplistic, beautiful magic system and interweaves it so seamlessly that you forget that you're reading fantasy. Like, they're talking about shit you shouldn't be able to do without magic. But it was so interwoven and played such a subtle role in the plot. It was fantastic. Like, it's not all fireballs and like smacking people and blowing things up. It was like soft manipulation, but with rarely any malice behind it. And it was beautiful. And that whole book is like a masterclass in writing like a fantastical biography of a fictional character. I loved it. I loved it so much. Right, my most surprising books. I'm going to go a little bit faster because I'm spending quite a lot of time on like runners up. Most surprising, Scales and Sensibility, because it looks like this and I actively enjoyed it. Who knew? I listened to the audiobook on Everand, very good. I haven't got to the second one yet, I will get there. It's a Regency romance where they have pet dragons and the pet dragons are involved in the plot. What's not to love? The Palm Wine Drinkard by Amos Tutoriola. This was like a fever dream. This was like it had been written on drugs, and I did not think I was going to enjoy it, and I absolutely loved it. Could not tell you what the plot was, could not tell you what was happening, but it was funny, it was ridiculous, it was batshit crazy, and I loved it. And then Immortality, a Love Story. Again, I thought I was going to DNF this because it's historical fantasy romance, low on the fantasy, but I loved it. I thought it was really well done. The romance was really understated. It was understandable. I could see where the motivations were. I thought it was realistic for what it was portraying, and it just really took me by surprise, and I loved the second one just as much as the first one. My most surprising was Under the Earth, Over the Sky. Is that right? I always get the words mixed up. This one by Emily McCosh, because again, it's about fae, and I've been a little bit like about fae. I think I've had enough of like the most popular depictions of fae, but this one was a faith story with no romance in it, because it focused on the familial father-son relationship between the king of this fey kingdom and the human boy that he saves, and just the bond that they share. And it was like the most lyrical writing. I didn't think I was going to enjoy the lyrical writing, and I did. I read it quite quickly, and it was like watching a painting come to life in my mind, is how I would best describe this one. The cat's trying to kill you. Oh, hello. Are you okay? Are you okay? You're gonna leave me alone now. It was beautiful. It took me by surprise. That was not the angle we started at. And that is 100% my most surprising read of this year. Swiftly followed by the most baffling book. Now, I have to put Spear Cuts Through Water on here, because that was unlike any book I've ever read. I was never 100% sure what I was reading, but I think I liked it all the same. I'm gonna put Ella Minope as a runner-up as well. Not because the story itself was confusing. I was confused as to how the author managed to write that book, because it's a fucking hellcat. What's the quickest way of explaining this? Ella Minope reduces the number of letters it's allowed to use within the story. So the language gets more and more complicated, the writing gets more and more complex / simple, because the author is using fewer and fewer letters as the book goes on, and that just blew my mind. It just blew my mind. The story itself was quite simple and easy to understand. Infuriating at times, but I understood it. But the writing, I cannot fathom how the author managed to do that. And my last runner-up for most baffling was Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death, just because this was bizarre. It was told from multiple points of view. It had partly from the point of view of Mrs. Death, partly from this other person. We jumped around in chronology a little bit. The writing was like unstructured. There was a chapter where there was no punctuation. Some of it was poetry, some of it was a play, and very literary. So reading this was an exercise in like, I felt a little bit like I was back in English class and we were like studying a text. It was one of those. I think I enjoyed my experience, but I did have to ruminate on that book quite a lot once I finished it. However, I have to give most baffling to Harrow the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. And if you've read the book, you know why, and I don't have to explain. So I'm going to leave it at that. Most disappointing, 2 runners-up are Krampus by Brom. This was not at all what I was expecting after having loved Slewfoot. It was urban, it was modern day fantasy. I really didn't enjoy the themes that we were exploring. I won't spoil anything, but it just really wasn't what I was expecting at all, and I was just really disappointed by that, because I thought it was going to be on the same level as Slewfoot. It really wasn't. It was a DNF for me. The other disappointing runner-up was Witch King by Martha Wells. This was on my most anticipated books of this year, and I hated it. I DNF'd it about 50 pages in. It was really hard to understand. There was no intrigue. Just as I was getting used to the weird world building, it would jump back in time, and then I'd have to get used to something else instead. And I felt like I was having to reset my understanding of the novel every couple of chapters, and I just really hated that. So that was DNF. But my most disappointing of the year was Candle and Crow by Kevin Hearn. I loved the Inconsiderable series through the first book. I liked the first third of the second book, and Candle and Crow was the third book that came out this year. And I was really disappointed in the second, and I was really hoping it was going to turn it around for the third book and get more interesting, get back to the magic of that first book, and it just didn't. And it was a DNF, and I was really upset because I think I pre-ordered it as well. So just bummed. I would recommend the first book in this series, but I didn't like the second and the third, and that's sad. For the most poignant book that I read this year, because I did read a little way out of my comfort zone, runners up are House of Frank, again, just because of the themes we were exploring and how well that was done, and the questions that book asked. That was hard hitting, and I think if I had been in a slightly more fragile place, that book would have destroyed me. Other runner up is My Sister the Serial Killer, just because the way that this dissects family ties was really interesting and infuriating, and just really made me think about different families and the different relationships that we have with family, and what we would or would not do for them. The winner is definitely Kindred. This was such a hard read. I had to listen to this in small chunks and like give myself time to recharge afterwards. This is heavy hitting, every trigger warning under the sun for this if you want to go read it, but I also absolutely would recommend this book if you think you can stomach some of the heavier topics which it goes into. This is about a woman who is unexpectedly pulled through time back to slavery times in America, and she ends up saving the life of a boy, and she gets a gun shoved in her face in thanks by the white boy's parents, and then she is tugged back in time, and it's about her journey to and from this place and the effect that she has on the people, and whether she can stomach, as a black woman, living that life for the period that this magic seems to be leaving her there for. That wasn't the greatest explanation in the world, but there's a lot of important questions. There's a lot of like graphic scenes depicted of what was just normal life back then, and that is not something I learned about much in school, because I was schooled in Brussels for most of my schooling, and then I was schooled here, so I did a lot of European history. I didn't do a lot of American history, but yeah, that was it was a hard read. So 2 quick ones. The longest book I read this year was The Grey House. This is translated from Russian by Mariam Petrosian. I loved this book, but this is also plotless, like completely plotless. But it's a brilliant character study and a joyous depiction of disability, if that sounds up your street. The shortest book I read was The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. This is a short story, so I don't know if it technically counts as a novel, but it was sold on its own, so this is a brilliant short story that I can't really tell you much about without spoiling what makes it brilliant, but it's about a girl who is chosen by, I believe it's the god of war, and the ensuing consequences. But it's a short story. It's really short. It's really well written for the short, like the length that it is, and I would really recommend it. The grossest book that I read shout out to the Ninth House series, because there's a lot of like body horror in that series. And also The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper. This was historical fiction about prostitutes in Roman times. This was gross, not in like blood and gore, but in the way that women were treated and prostitutes were treated, and the misogyny from that time. That really grossed me out to the point where I couldn't continue the series. But the winner for the grossest book has to be someone you can build a nest in, because Shisheshan is the protagonist, and she is disgusting. She is just vile, and she's also my baby, and I would die for her. 2 more. The queerest book that I read, runners up are A Court of Wanderers, because this was poly and queer and everything under the sun. Vampires, second book in the duology. Silver Under Nightfall is the first one, highly recommend. And then A Grim and Sunken Vow. This is the third in the Dark and Hollow Star series. This has got a huge cast of characters, and they're all queer. It's YA urban fantasy. It's really complex and in-depth, and I would recommend it if that is the kind of thing you like to read. But the winner has to go to Sky on Fire by Jen Lyons, just because the queer relationships that were displayed in this book, I loved. I just loved them. I thought they were so well done. I didn't think they were cringy, which I often do. I just thought they were really well fleshed out, and they didn't deter from the plot at all. They weren't a distraction. They were flavouring. They were good flavouring. And then lastly, the wildest book I read this year was The Palm Wine Drinkard, because it was just bonkers. I have not read anything like that ever in my life. It was a joyful, ridiculous, insane experience, and I hugely recommend it to anyone that wants to like shake up their reading a little bit, because it's like unlike anything I've ever read before, and I loved it. And that is it. Those are my superlatives for 2024. Let me know if you've read any of these. Are any of them on your TBR for next year? Let me know. What are your superlatives for this year? Pick a couple of the ones that I just talked about and tell me what your submissions would be if this is a real award, because I'd love to know. Like this video and subscribe if you like it. Hit the bell if you'd like to be notified when I post. My Patreon is linked down below if you would like to support me. And yeah, I will see you in the next video. See you then.